This is the Rational Reminder Podcast, a weekly reality check on sensible investing and financial decision-making from two Canadians. We are hosted by me, Benjamin Felix, and Cameron Passmore, portfolio managers at PWL Capital.
Welcome to episode 222, and this week we had a chance to speak with Cassie Holmes, who's the author of a just-released book called Happier Hour: How to Beat Distraction, Expand Your Time, and Focus on What Matters Most.
And the ER in there, the happier, is a very important part of the title. There's a lot of information in there as we learned from Cassie in this conversation.
So Cassie is a professor of marketing and behavioral decision-making at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and one of the courses she teaches is called Applying the Science of Happiness to Life Design, and this book is based on that very popular course. Cassie also has a PhD in marketing from Stanford and is a trained social psychologist.
And she tells us in the episode a bunch of the exercises or assignments that she has her students in the class do to help them get in tune with what a good life and what happiness look like, and how to learn about themselves. So we actually get some pretty cool practical tools from Cassie during this conversation.
And she's worked with past guests, Hal Hirschfield, who was a guest in episode 141, Ashley Willens, who was a guest in 143, as well as Katie Milkman, who's a good friend of the podcast. Great conversation, I thought. Lots to learn, lots to apply to your own life to be happier.
Right.
Anything else?
No, great conversation. It reinforces a lot of stuff that we've learned before. And then, of course, Cassie from her own primary research also has lots of new insights for us. So it's a worthwhile conversation. Time well spent, I would say.
All right. So with that, here's our conversation with Cassie Holmes. Cassie Holmes, welcome to the Rational Reminder Podcast.
Hello, Cameron. It's so great to be here.
It's so great to welcome you as well. And I loved your book, so congratulations on that.
Thank you. It was, speaking of time, it took a lot of time, but hopefully it's worthwhile in helping folks be happier.
Excellent. Well, let's kick it off with, scientifically speaking, why is being happy a good thing?
Yeah, and it's a really important question because sometimes people think of happiness as somewhat of a frivolous thing that might seem indulgent, but it's absolutely not. And I would actually say that the last couple of years, folks have come to recognize just how important it is with anxiety rates, depression rates, burnout rates as high as they are. Everyone has come to recognize just how important our emotional well-being is. To your question of, are there studies to show just how important our well-being is? Absolutely. And research has shown that feeling happy benefits across our domains of life in the workplace, in our interpersonal relationships with respect to health. For example, in the workplace, when we feel happy, it increases our creativity. It makes us more adaptive problem solvers. The happy employees are more engaged and better performers. It helps us in our interpersonal relationships. So when we feel happy, we like others more. We are liked by others more. We're more likely to help others out, which helps us in our interpersonal relationships, as well as if you think of that in the workplace. When we feel happy, we're more likely to help our colleagues. We're more committed to the organization at large. Also, with respect to health, happiness increases our immune functioning, our threshold for pain, and makes us more likely to stick to our treatment regimes. And correlationally, it's associated with longevity. So all of this is to say that, yes, we want to be happy. Like, wouldn't that be nice? And we want to be happier, which I actually think is an important qualifier and the title of my book, Happier Hour, is purposeful. It's not about happy that you turn on, yes or no, I am or I am not. It's what can we do to feel better? And so feeling better has these positive consequences.
So you're talking about empirical research there. When that research is being done, how is happiness being measured?
Yeah. And in those cases, that was looking at the consequences of happiness. So in some cases, it's correlational, but sometimes it's even manipulated. Like people are made to feel happy. But to your question, how do we look at what are the inputs that make us feel better, that make us feel happy? And we measure happiness and when I'm even referring to happiness, what I'm talking about is the emotion that we feel in the day-to-day. So more positive emotion than negative emotion. And as well as there's this cognitive evaluation of how satisfied are you with your life overall. So to measure emotion, it is asking, typically it is, how are you feeling right now on how much enjoyment, how much happiness, how stressed, how worried, so that you can sort of take the difference and parse out the positive emotions, as well as what also happiness is limiting those negative emotions of stress and worry. So it can be right now. It can also be reflecting back over the last day, over the last week, how frequently or to what extent have you felt positive emotion? Have you felt negative emotion? But then there's this other evaluative component, which I think is so important. And that's how satisfied do you feel with your life overall? And I think part of that, as I am interested in it, is really sort of a outcome that I'm striving for folks in the book and in my research, is how satisfied, how fulfilled. And then there's also how much meaning there is, which is a little bit of a different construct, but it moves empirically, it moves very closely with this life satisfaction. And all of this is what I sort of lump into when I use the word happiness, which, there's like positives and negatives of using that term. I think it's something that folks can all relate to and understand, but there are these different components of it.
Interesting. So when you say happier, it's like some combination of all of those different things.
Yeah, it's feeling better in your life as well as feeling better about your life.
Oh, that's nice.
So you teach a course, which I understand is quite popular, called Applying the Science of Happiness to Life Design. How did you ever convince your business school to teach a class on happiness? Like, how did that happen?
It took some convincing, I will admit. And I will also say it took me some time to decide that it was just as important as it is, that I would take it to the curriculum committee and offer to develop this course based off of my years of research, the research that's in the literature. And so I was like, our students need this. That was what I was saying. I was like, and I want to teach this because this is what I've been studying and I know about. And sadly, I don't want to sort of dishearten my fellow academics out there. While we write these empirical papers, not a lot of folks read them, right? Because it's our fellow academics. But I was like, but there's so many insights that can be applied in our publications that I was like, people could use this, could apply this. Hence the title of the course, Applying the Science of Happiness to Life Design. So I went to my business or to the curriculum committee and like, I want to teach this course. And initially they're like, no. Why does happiness, is there a place for it at a business school? And then I was like, there is a place. So I came back with data, some of which I just shared with you guys, the research that shows how it helps us in the workplace. And as we are educators of our future business leaders, we want to understand, how do we sort of teach our students not just to have the skills to get that first job, which absolutely that is our job, but also we want our students to succeed and thrive in their careers, both 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. And what that requires them to do is figure out, how do I take care of myself so I don't get burnt out, such that I continue to stay engaged and engaged in my work. But also, as they are going to have teams that are working under them, understanding how can they support the individuals within their organization so that they too can thrive and be engaged and produce at their best level. So I did convince them. And I will say they are very supportive of the course now. And again, like post-pandemic or in the midst of the pandemic, when all of us individually, as well as from an organizational perspective, have had to reckon with emotional well-being. And, as organizations are trying to figure out how do you retain your employees, how do you recruit them, with this great resignation, the quiet quitting, all of these things where actually it's become, no one can ignore it anymore. But I will say that UCLA Anderson got on board with the importance of it even before it's become so starkly needed.
A course like this, I think, is important because people often get what actually will make them happy backwards. Can you talk a little bit about the things that people think will make them happy?
Yeah. So oftentimes people think the things that people think will make them happy are based off of these general notions of success and these general sort of considerations of wants, right? If only I had a whole lot of money, then I would be not only successful, but I would be happy. If only I were super attractive. If only I met someone that, the love of my life that I wanted to get married to. If only I had awesome stuff, this fancy house, fancy cars, then I would be happy. And interestingly, there's research to look at what's the initial effect of those things on our happiness, as well as what's the lasting effect of those things on our happiness. And what you see is that A, they don't have as strong of an initial effect than you think. B, we adapt. So they don't have a lasting effect. So taking money, for example, income level, there is a relationship, and the strongest relationship is actually among the low income levels. Like if you aren't able to meet your basic needs, yes, absolutely, more money has an effect on your happiness because it's reducing that worry, it's reducing that stress. It's allowing you to feel sure that you will be able to pay your bills, get food on the table. But beyond that, you see that the relationship is weaker and significantly less strong than we expect. And then you also see, when I talked about the lasting effects, that we adapt over time. So there's interesting longitudinal work that looks at what if, based off of effect sizes, if you got a raise in your salary, like 50% raise, yes, initially you do see this boost in satisfaction, but in that data, it was within 4 years, people return to their baseline.
Right.
And there's a couple of reasons that it doesn't have as strong of an effect as you might think. One is social comparison. So you're asking like, how satisfied are you? And you have income as this very salient sort of assessment of how you're doing in life. And you're like, well, how satisfied? Well, like, how am I doing compared to those around me? And as you get wealthier, the folks who are around you are also wealthier. So there's always someone who is making more and better off on some of these dimensions. A lot of these dimensions, right? The ones that I said, the fancy house, attractiveness, so social comparison undermines. So attractiveness, people are like, oh, if you're super gorgeous, then I'd be super happy, and gorgeous people must be super happy. And there is a significant effect, but it's such a small one. Like it is not getting into statistics, it is a very small one. Also, the effect of getting married. So you see that on wedding day, yes, there is this boost, but over time, people return back to baseline. So social comparison is one factor, but also hedonic adaptation. So this is our tendency that when we are exposed to something again and again, or experience something again and again, we get used to it over time such that it doesn't have as strong of an impact on our feelings. So it's good that we adapt when bad stuff happens because it makes us resilient, right? It stops to feel as awful, as painful over time. But it's bad when good stuff happens because it stops making us as happy over time. And we can talk about this later because I sort of pull it in across the book to figure out how can we offset hedonic adaptation such that those happinesses, those joys in our daily life continue to have the effect that they could potentially have, so that we can continue to feel happy with the time that we spend on these activities that are so potentially happy without missing out just because we're not paying attention.
So where do these perceptions, I think you called them the if-onlys, so where do these perceptions of happiness come from?
Yeah, I think they come from general notions of success. And it's a very, like being at a business school, there are notions of what success is. And I think it gets heightened in the business context, particularly the focus on wealth and material possessions. But I think it is largely sort of cultural.
Interesting. Okay. I was wondering if it's cultural or is there like a biological drive to get more stuff?
I think it's cultural because you see some cultures which are less driven by stuff, by material possessions, than we are within the sort of Western, and I can speak for the United States. I know maybe Canadians are less materialistic, but
we're pretty similar. I think.
Yeah.
But
guess. I think it's actually can be quite damaging for our happiness if we are striving for these general notions of what success is. And given that those metrics of success aren't as linked to our emotional well-being and satisfaction as folks expect they'll be. And so that's why I spend a lot of time in my course applying the science of happiness to life design and the book, Happier Hour, to help people figure out for themselves, what are they striving for? What are their ultimate goals? Not they. I mean, like you as an individual, what ultimately drives you? And one of the exercises that I love in the book is this 5 whys exercise, which asks like, so what do you do? And oftentimes it's in the context of work, but it doesn't have to be. So folks who don't work can absolutely gain from this as well and benefit from it. So what do you do? And then like, why is that important? Is your first level of why. And then, well, that's interesting. Why is that important? And once you ask yourself sort of 5 levels, it really drills down and helps you identify for you what really matters, what is driving you, what is your purpose. And this is really helpful because once you identify for you, and I share my example, and actually going through this exercise has proven supremely helpful for me. So if you guys want to hear it in more concrete terms, so I'm like, okay, what do? I am a business school professor. What is the role of that? What's the importance of it? Well, it's to do research, teach, and then administrative stuff. Well, why is that important? It's like, okay, well, it's to develop knowledge and disseminate knowledge, and then the administrative stuff. And then like, why is that important? Well, I want to make people smart, but like, why smart? And I was like, well, actually, it's about being smart about their happiness. Like, I want people to be smart about what makes them happy. So creating knowledge about what makes people happy. And then I want them to be smart and share the research, share the insights. So disseminating knowledge about what makes people happy. And then with service or in general is helping make people happy. And so by me identifying for myself, that is my purpose. So when I am doing tasks, I can be like, is this in line with what I've set out to do? And when it does, it is so fulfilling. And it is notably, my goal is very different than those around me. And so actually looking at how am I, like when I'm like, how am I doing? I don't need to look at those around me because they're striving for something different. But it's very fulfilling when you are accomplishing on your goal along the way. And it's very clear. So it's like, it's not this general like notion of like, oh, if only I had more, if only I were doing more. The only parts where it's like, I want to do more and be motivated is like, if I am falling short of my own goal, if I'm like, oh, actually, I could do this to create knowledge about what makes people happy, disseminate knowledge. So it's helpful in terms of identifying where you're going to be spending your time. What are those activities that are worthwhile for your own purpose? It's helpful for assessing how you're doing. Your own sense of satisfaction derives from that, as well as it actually makes some ways of spending time that might not feel particularly fun in the moment. Once you realize like, oh, actually this is in service, not of this sort of general notion of being successful, but actually it's in service of like what I'm striving for, then it's like, okay, sure, I will, whatever, spend an hour on email, even though it's not fun. It's like, but it allows me to work with my research team or disseminate knowledge with my students about what makes them happy. So it makes it feel more worthwhile.
What are the evidence-based determinants of happiness?
There are several. And I would say the biggest is a relationship. So, and actually I sort of frame all of this with respect to time. So if you're looking at what are the inputs into happiness, so our natural inherited disposition is at play. So were you born a sort of glass half full type person, more cheery disposition where you see the positive of things or not? That does have an effect, actually a sizable effect on how we feel in the day-to-day and our satisfaction. And then there are these circumstances like income level, like attractiveness, like marital status that do have an effect. But as I already mentioned, they have a smaller effect than we expect. But there is this sort of other bucket that has a significant effect. And that is what we do and what we're thinking about in the day-to-day. And I think, given my perspective and my research, I think it's very sort of more precisely, how do we invest the time? How do we spend our time? And what are we thinking about during that time? How do we mentally approach that time? So to say that, okay, how do we invest our time? How do we engage in that time in a meaningful way? And then the question, which I don't know, which was actually what you were asking, or this is what you're asking, is like, okay, well then how should we be spending our time? What are the ways of spending time that have a significant positive effect on your happiness? The answer to that is, well, I have exercises to allow folks to identify for themselves, but there are the very clear underlying dimensions that research shows. And social connection, genuine social connection, the extent to which you feel a sense of belonging, investing in time in ways that increase that are absolutely critical to the happiness we feel in our days, as well as our satisfaction we feel about our lives. And then there are other ways of spending time. And actually, I don't know if you want me to dig sort of deeper into this role of social connection, because I think it touches really interestingly on some of the previous questions that you guys asked of like, what are these notions of contributors to happiness? And oftentimes, these notions of like, if only fame or money. And there was a really interesting longitudinal study conducted out of Harvard over 75 years. What they did was they tracked a cohort of men starting in their youth. Some were Harvard students, some were living in Boston, just not Harvard students. And they tracked them over the course of their lives, touching in with them or touching base with them and measuring what are they doing, how are they doing. And from this, you could see accumulating this data and looking back on their lives, the single biggest predictor of satisfaction, of happiness in their lives was not wealth, was not fame. What it was having strong, supportive relationships. And those relationships could come in the form of friendship or family. But it was making sure that you had relationships that were real and genuine and available to you for that support, as well as the fun of it. So all to say, investing time in people and in the relationships that you have is absolutely critical to happiness. There's also things like exercise. Exercise is one of these things that we feel like we don't have time for, and so we don't do. But it's been shown to be a significant mood booster. It helps offset anxiety, depression. It increases our self-esteem. Being outside, spending time outside, there's really interesting geolocation data that from a study out of the UK, where they would like at any moment could see where the individual was, and they would ping them and ask how happy they are. And what they saw was there was a significant effect of simply being outside compared to being inside. And yes, even better if it's sunny, and even better if you're in a natural environment versus an urban environment, but simply being outside had a significant positive effect. Yeah, we're inside 85% of the time, according to their data. And I'm sure it depends on where you live.
Wow.
Interesting. Well, is the longitudinal study, is that the Harvard one?
The longitudinal study, yes, is the Harvard adult development.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned there's the biological set point, there's the stable circumstances, and then there's how you spend your time. And then within how you spend your time, investing in social relationships is the most important.
It does have, I would say, the most important. But then there's these others, like of doing things that contribute to your sense of, sort of pulling from self-determination theory, which shows that our primary drivers are relatedness or relationships. So we've talked about that. There's also competence. So the extent to which we feel like we are successful at achieving our goals, and agency, the extent to which we feel like we have some say or control in how we sort of dedicate our efforts and time. And so competence, that's where picking up on this role of purpose, which I talked about before, that to the extent that you are able to identify, perhaps using the 5 whys exercise, what is it that ultimately drives you? And then you're spending time on activities that help you fulfill those goals. That time is also really fulfilling. And this is actually when, pulling in the idea of fulfillment, spending time in ways that you feel like you are working towards your goals. And oftentimes this requires sort of quieting outside distractions. So Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he termed this as flow, of when you are immersed in a state that is using your skills and is intrinsically motivating, so aligned with your purpose, and you are not distracted. It's like you lose your sense of time. You are so engaged. And in these states of flow, you really create at your best. You're performing at your best. And when you come out of those states, it's like so satisfying and so fulfilling. So to the extent that you are investing your time on activities that allow you to feel that way, are really in those worthwhile ways, are important. Yet another activity that I think, or exercise that I absolutely encourage folks to do, and which I talk about in detail, how to do this, is time tracking, so that you can identify for yourself. So over the course of 1 to 2 weeks, I say 2 weeks just because it gives you a more complete representation of the types of activities that will fill your time. But even if it's 1 week, because it's sort of tedious to do, but it's worthwhile, is writing down every half hour, what are you doing or what have you done? And not just these broad ideas of or categories of work, family, but being more specific. So you can pull out, what are the work activities? Like for me, it's like working on writing my book versus going to a faculty meeting. Those are both work, but experienced very differently. And in addition to writing down the activity, is rating on a 10-point scale, how did that activity make you feel? And that 10-point scale is picking up satisfaction, picking up enjoyment, picking up fulfillment. And so, but what's really cool about at the end of the week, you have this amazing data set that's personalized just for you. So you can pull out and identify what are those activities that got your highest ratings, and what are the underlying dimensions of those happiest activities. And you'll see very likely that it's about social connection. That is about activities that help you feel a sense of purpose or like satisfaction from achieving whatever goal that you have. Also exercise. But interestingly, with exercise, oftentimes you'll see that, yes, maybe you felt good during it, but also you can pick up on the sort of carryover effects on subsequent activities. So you can see like ratings of even with sleep, like on days when you've worked out in the morning, you've gotten a good night's sleep, you'll probably see on average your ratings across that next day are higher. From that exercise, you can also pull out what are those activities that get your lowest ratings. And you can also see just how much time you're spending across your various activities. So you can pick out what are potentially ways you're wasting your time, that if you're spending a whole lot of time on something that is not all that necessary and are getting middling ratings according to you, then that helps you figure out how can you sort of reallocate away from the wasted time, invest more in those worthwhile, and by worthwhile, it's according to you, those activities that made you feel enjoyment, made you feel satisfied, made you feel fulfilled. So yes, there's research that can speak to, on average, what are the types of activities that are more worthwhile. But I think even more helpfully is for you to collect your data so you can identify those activities or those dimensions across activities that are most worthwhile.
So to what extent is being happy a decision that people make as opposed to a natural state of being, like your natural disposition?
So it's both, but one we have control over and one we don't. So we have our natural disposition. You're lucky or unlucky, and we don't have a lot of control over that. The thing that we all have control over, no matter where our sort of natural disposition puts us along the continuum, is how we spend our time, how we engage in that time. And that's the part that I'm really excited about and have been researching and wrote a book and teaching a course of helping, no matter what your starting point is, how can you invest to feel better in your days and more satisfied about your life. So we do have choice. And it just takes understanding initially and reflection, as well as knowledge from the data and the empirics. but also it takes practice. It requires not just knowing what are those activities that are most worthwhile for you, but actually spending the time, investing the time, making the time for, protecting time for those activities that are worthwhile.
Does someone's natural disposition change over time?
No, that's the baseline. You do see age effects, but that's sort of picking up across averages. Like you get the distribution of folks along their natural disposition. But you do see that across the population, there are patterns with respect to age. So, and I've done this research as well to look at how does age influence how we experience happiness, as well as the types of experiences that elicit happiness. And we have found, for instance, that in terms of how people experience happiness, younger people tend to experience or associate happiness more with sort of excitement and that sort of loud happiness. As people get older, it becomes more about calm contentment. And this plays into partly is the types of experiences that elicit greater happiness. So younger people, we looked at what's the happiness that people enjoy from extraordinary experiences versus ordinary experiences. Extraordinary experiences being those sort of like life milestones, once in a lifetime vacations, going out to, exciting concerts or going to like the best restaurant in the world type of things, versus the ordinary experiences, which are those sort of simple moments shared with a loved one, whether it's a friend, family member, or pet, often shows up in the data. Enjoying a treat, noticing your beautiful surroundings, a sunrise or a sunset. And what we found was that among younger people, they tend to experience greater happiness from extraordinary experiences compared to ordinary experiences. What was really interesting is as people get older, they experience greater happiness, an increasing amount of happiness from those ordinary experiences, such that among our sort of older, if you're, doing a median split on the data, that older folks experience as much happiness from these ordinary, simple moments as they do extraordinary experiences, which is really important. And we found, and the reason it's important because it highlights how much happiness is available to us without a lot of money, without, traveling the world or going to eat at the best restaurant in the world or whatever it is, that there's a lot of potential happiness right there in our day-to-day, everyday life. And what we also found is when we made young people recognize that their time in life is limited, just like older people naturally do. So as people age, they start recognizing that their time in life is limited because it is becoming more limited and therefore salient. But when we make young people recognize that their time in life is also limited, then you see that they start to savor more. They notice those simple pleasures and moments and enjoy as much happiness from them. And so this is a big point that I make in the book, is that there's a lot of happiness available to us in the day-to-day, in our mundane, ordinary moments, that it's so easy and we so tend to miss just because we're not paying attention, because we're distracted. So research shows that we are distracted almost 50% of the time. So if we're not paying attention half the time to what we're doing, of course we're going to miss the moments that we're spending. So yes.
I was going to ask if then young people should do like the trip around the world, like you mentioned, when they're younger, but it sounds like maybe they should just remind themselves that they're going to die and not need to take the trip around the world.
I will say the trips around the world, like the extraordinary experiences, do produce a lot of happiness, irrespective of age. So you see that it's high across age. It's just that ordinary experiences too offer happiness. And so if you don't have access to the trip around the world, then also recognize that you can look right around you and enjoy happiness.
Would it still make sense to say then that if someone was going to do a trip around the world or whatever other big awe-inducing experience, it's better to do that when they're younger?
No, actually, it's
Okay.
because you don't see a decrease in the happiness from extraordinary. It's just a catching up of the ordinary.
Oh,
Gotcha.
Interesting. Cool. I'm glad I asked about that.
Yeah, but I don't want to dissuade you from the trip around the world, because there's that will be exciting and it will be happy no matter how old you are. And then in the days around your trip around the world, paying attention to what's in your daily life so that you can also be feeling happy during that time.
You don't need to dissuade me. I don't like traveling anyway. So I want to come back for a second to the natural state idea. When you were talking about that earlier, would it make sense to say that like within a group of people, differences in happiness will be partially explained by their whatever heritable characteristics, but for an individual person, that almost becomes irrelevant because the actions will influence you relative to your own set point. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's totally right. And that's, again, sort of, I touched on it earlier when I talked about the title of the book, Happier Hour.
Oh, I see.
It's for you individually.
Yep.
How can you spend your time? How can you sort of shift your mindset so that you can feel happier, as happy as you can, irrespective of those around you? It's actually, it's for happiness. You should not be like, one trick to feel happier is not to be looking at those around you to assess how you're doing. Social comparison undermines happiness, even in those like rare cases where you're like, oh, I must be doing fine because they're doing worse off. We're actually more sensitive and pay more attention to those who are doing better than us. So don't look to those around you to assess how you're doing. Your goal, each of our goals, is to be happier, as happy as we individually can be, and we have choice in that.
Yeah, that's super insightful. You talked earlier about the importance of relationships. This may sound like a silly question, but like, what constitutes a relationship from that perspective?
Yeah. And it's really that sort of underlying sense of social connection. So going back to why the time tracking research is so helpful is that there are individual differences in what types of activities really give you that sense of social connection. I can, like, just using me versus my son as an example. I am an introvert. My source of sense of social connection absolutely comes from a one-on-one conversation with someone. His sense of social connection comes from being in a group of people. But in terms of a sense of closeness with another individual, that is based off of, and one of the exercises that I have my students do, and I describe in the book, is this relationship closeness induction task, which is a series of questions that go from sort of most basic, the types of question, and it's only a 15-minute task, like exercise, but from it, people feel significantly closer and like they are a friend of the other person, even if they started off as strangers. So what it is like the first set of questions are these like, what's your name? What do you do? Like the things that typically are the things that people talk about at a cocktail party. But those aren't the things that make us feel close and connected. You then move on to the next set of questions for 5 minutes, where it is like, how do you like to spend your time? Like it's about your daily experience, and you can have people reflect on their experiences. And it's these questions that are deeper. And then the last set of questions is where you really get that sense of connection, where it's like, what was your favorite childhood memory? what are you really proud of? What's a big fear? So it's not just your experience, but it's also your emotional experience. And what you see in this is this reciprocal and escalating self-disclosure. So reciprocal because these questions, I ask, you answer, then you ask me and I answer. So it's a two-way street. Both have to be listening as well as disclosing. And the increasing disclosure, the sort of personal nature of it, is where you get that sense of closeness. So for, like when I talked about the Harvard adult development study at the end of life, having strong supportive relationships, it is having people that know you and you feel known by, and that care about you and you feel cared for by. And so those are those strong relationships, close relationships. But again, there's individual differences and like a general sense of connection and belonging that happens. There's some variation on whether it's few people, like one person, or what settings sort of propel that.
So it's a little bit subjective. It almost sounds weird to ask because it's like over-engineering social relationships, but do you think people should be conscious of whether they're getting that if they're investing time in relationships?
Totally. Yeah. Because it's both from the relationship. So if you're spending a lot of time with someone and it doesn't feel great. So there's also work that shows that there are these toxic friendships that have a very negative effect. Actually, the effect is stronger because, as we all know, or as it shows up in so many different contexts, we are more sensitive to negative inputs than we are to positive inputs. So removing those toxic relationships that every time you spend time with this person, you come away feeling lousy, don't spend the time. But also within the types of activities, if you're looking at, your time tracking data, for instance, and you're like, oh, these are social, but it's like, as an example, if I go to lunch with my colleagues, it's like a group of 8 colleagues, versus I go to coffee with one colleague, and I can look at my ratings. And from that, I'm like, oh, wow, those lunches with the groups, for me personally, no sense of social connection, but they do require, right. That took an hour of my time. Whereas my coffee with an individual colleague, I come out and I'm feeling like super connected, super happy. That's really informative. So, and it's not to say that the other colleagues at the lunch, is just to say, I need to make time for me with each one of those colleagues individually instead of in that group setting. So again, the time tracking exercise and the way that you can analyze or sort of make sense and find patterns in your own data is so insightful.
Can you talk about the relationship between discretionary time and happiness?
Yeah, and this is stemming from personal experience that I shared in motivating the book, in motivating Happier Hour. And it was from me feeling like I just didn't have enough time. And there was this sort of very salient day or night earlier in my career when I was still living in Philly on the faculty at Wharton. And I had gone up that day to give a talk in New York. And it was like my presentation was sandwiched within these back-to-back meetings. And then I'm like rushing to a networking, like a colleague dinner, rushing to get the very last train that would get me home to my 4-month-old and my husband back in Philly. And I did make the train, but as I was sitting on the train that night, looking out the window, everything was rushing by. And I was so exhausted and felt so defeated. And I'm like, I don't know if I can keep up between the pressures of work, the trying to be a good parent, trying to be a good partner, trying to be a good friend, that never ending pile of chores. There simply weren't enough hours in the day to get it all done, let alone to do any of it well, let alone to enjoy any of it along the way. And I'm like, I know what I need. I need a whole lot of discretionary time. And to do that, I should quit my job and move to a sunny island somewhere. Because with this idea, which I'm sure so many in those crazy days can relate to, is like, if maybe I need to quit. So if I had a whole lot more time, I'd be a whole lot happier. And so before I quit my like dream job, we tested this. So with some of my favorite collaborators, Hal Hirschfield, whom you know, Cameron, and Marissa Sharif, we tested what's the relationship between the amount of discretionary time that folks have and their happiness. And across studies, one of the things that we did was we analyzed data from the American Time Use Survey, which captures for tens of thousands of working and non-working Americans how they spent the hours of a regular day. And from that, we calculated how much time they spent on discretionary activities and their happiness. And we saw this really interesting pattern, which was an upside down U shape. So it was a negative quadratic relationship, like an arc or a rainbow. So on the one side, you saw that in this data set, folks with less than approximately 2 hours of discretionary time in a day were less happy. And that was me on the train that night. That was all of you whom I'm sure relate to that feeling of not having enough time and being stressed about it. But what was really interesting was the other side of the arc, where we saw that in this data set, those with more than approximately 5 hours of discretionary time in this regular day were also less happy. And so what this suggests is that there's actually such thing as having too much time. Not only is it that maybe more time doesn't continue, like more and more isn't better, but actually there's such thing as too much. And digging into that, what our data and additional studies suggest is that we are driven to be productive. So we are averse to being idle when we spend hours upon hours of our days with nothing to show for those hours. It undermines, we feel less productive. It undermines our sense of purpose. And from that, we feel dissatisfied. And so I think this is a really important thing for folks to keep in mind, that it's not that having a whole lot of discretionary time is the answer to happiness. And maybe like folks can relate to that, on the first day of your beach vacation, it is quite decadent, and maybe even second and third. The fourth morning you wake up, or speaking for myself, that fourth morning, I'm like, all right, guys, what are we going to do today? I'm like, enough of this sitting around, like, let's do stuff. So with that, you can sort of pick up on the psychology of this, that we don't want to be overly busy. We don't want our days to just be full with these, often in cases, sort of not necessarily worthwhile, but just sort of full. What we want is our days, and so we don't want to look back and just be depleted. What we want is to look back, and even if we're somewhat busy, that we look back and feel fulfilled, right? So it's not about how much time you have available. It's really how you invest the time you have. And that's actually what propelled, I did not quit my job. Instead, I actually shifted my research agenda to figure out, okay, so it's not about how much time, how do we spend it? And that's what sort of motivated my subsequent research, as well as developing the course, as well as Happier Hour, is, okay, how should we be investing this resource that we do have that is limited? Absolutely, it is limited, both in our days as well as in our lives. But it's not just a problem, because this is this resource that we get to invest, and this is a life that we're living. How we spend our hours add up to our days, our years, and our life overall. So it's absolutely critical that we figure out how we allocate, how we invest the hours that we have so that we feel happier during them and we reflect on them with greater satisfaction and happiness.
Did you say the optimal amount of discretionary time is 2 hours per day?
So in this particular data set, we saw that between 2 and 5 hours, it was flat. So
Okay.
that there's this pretty wide swath. And what's interesting about that 2 hours, and I don't want everyone to like be like hang their hat on that specific number, but it does say, I think is actually helpful because 2 hours at the face of it initially was like, that there's no way if like there's no way I would have like 2 hours in a regular workday to do whatever I wanted. But actually looking into how I spent even, during those days of having my 4-month-old and being an assistant professor at Wharton, even within those days, I was like, okay, well, I spend 20 minutes in the morning sort of cuddling with my little guy. As I'm walking home, I'm on the phone with my best friend for another half hour. Sure, I would prefer to be like sitting over a glass of wine with her while talking, but I'm still getting that connection with her. Having dinner with my husband, it's like adding it up. I was like, even at that time where I felt like I had no time, it's like, actually, I have about an hour and a half in my day, even a regular day, that was absolutely joyful. I wouldn't have wanted to spend those 90 minutes in any other way. And with that, I was like, actually 2 hours isn't totally out of reach. So again, I don't want folks to like hang their hat on the 2 hours, but it does suggest, and actually pulling from some of the other insights and results of the book, that it isn't so much about how much time you spend on your various activities. It's really making sure that you get the most of those hours, the most of that time. So even the joyful, I talked about the role of distraction and the happiness from ordinary moments. If you are spending your time, even on those busiest days, on these activities that there's a lot of happiness, like right there available for you, make sure that you're paying attention, that you don't miss out, so that those minutes have a significant effect on how happy you feel overall.
You talked earlier about the best ways to use time. Are there worst ways to use time?
Yeah, so and this again can get very easily identified in your time tracking exercise and your personal data. There are worse ways of spending time. So actually picking back up on those drives from self-determination theory of relatedness. So if you're spending time in a way that thwarts that, if you spend your time in a way that actually makes you feel lonely, that's bad. Social media is one of the activities that research has shown can actually increase sense of loneliness, because what you're doing, particularly, so if you, and there's also differences in use of social media. If you use it passively to watch other people's lives, you have negative effects. If you actually use it actively to connect with others, and engage with those others that are in your life, that you have relationships with, then it actually has positive effects. But passively looking at other people's lives, which is the majority of the time spent on social media, that actually increases sense of loneliness, because you're watching them, you're not interacting with them, and you feel like you're missing out. Things that make you feel incompetent or don't give you a sense of agency. So like things that feel like a waste. So commuting, research shows that for the average person, hours spent commuting are among the least happy because they feel like a waste. You're just trying to get through that time and it feels like a waste. For many, work hours feel unhappy And I think that's because for many, it's undermining our sense of agency. It feels like an obligation. It's not, if you haven't done the work to identify what pieces of your job are in line with your purpose, then it also feels like a waste. And with the pandemic, we're not in the same space as our colleagues anymore. And so we don't get that social connection, that those friendships that sort of traditionally were available to us and cultivated through our time at work. And housework, an obligation, not fun. So there are ways of spending time that are not positive. And then the question is like, okay, some of those are necessary and some of those are not. Unnecessary, social media, but necessary is household chores, right?
Right.
And parts of your work. So I share, it's helpful to identify that unnecessary because hopefully with that intentionality, you just spend less time on those activities. You minimize the waste. But for the necessary ones, I share strategies of how to make them feel less wasteful and more worthwhile. For instance, one strategy that's super helpful that's coming out of research by Katie Milkman and colleagues, it's such a simple idea but has a big effect, is bundling.
Yeah.
So taking this unfun activity, like commuting, bundle it with something that is totally fun, like listening to the Rational Reminder podcast or listening to the audiobook of Happier Hour. These ways of spending time that, or calling your friend on the phone, these are ways to make the time, you're learning something, you're feeling a sense of connection, it's enriching. So all of a sudden that time you spent that felt like a waste commuting or while folding laundry, for instance, all of a sudden feels more worthwhile. So you can make those wasteful ways feel more worthwhile and therefore happier.
Is the best way to avoid time poverty simply saying no to requests?
It's saying no to particular requests. And this is touching back to the 5 whys exercise. And once you identify your purpose and even looking at your time tracking data and know what are those ways of spending time that actually do make you feel happy, using those as filters. These incoming requests are incessant. And it feels easier to say yes than no in that moment. But the cost of saying yes is high because then you're experiencing those days overcommitted to things that aren't even fun, aren't even worthwhile.
Yep.
You've wasted entire days, even though you've been really busy, right, in these obligations. So use a filter. So it's not saying no to everything. It is saying no to those incoming requests that are not in service of your purpose or in line with your purpose, and which you know are not going to be, that you're not going to have fun doing them. And then spending time in ways. So using those filters is a very effective way. And it's super important because there's interesting work that the effect, I love the name of the effect, because it highlights is the yes damn effect. So we always think that we will have more time in a month from now than we have today. Yep. And so we say yes to things for a month from now because we're like, oh, I won't be as busy then as I am today. But there's no way in heck that I would say yes to it if I was asked today because I'm so busy. But what a month from now, it's just like, today where you end up being really busy. And so you say yes, and then a month later, you're like, damn it, I shouldn't have said yes. So recognizing that while we think we will have more time in the future available to us, we will not. So use that also as a way of for an incoming request, would I be happy to say yes to do it today? That's a good gauge of whether you will be happy a month from now when you're actually sort of faced with the time to do it. So you don't say no to everything, but use these filters to figure out what you should say yes to. And then you do say no to everything else.
You talked earlier about productivity and feeling productive being good. Can productivity become too much of a focus?
Yes. We want to feel productive. So we're driven to feel productive. But because it's like to feel satisfied, we need to feel somewhat productive. But when you then shift productivity to be the goal, then that you become sort of hyper focused on that, losing sense of like these other contributors to your ultimate satisfaction. So, and what's also interesting is in our culture, when like productivity sort of and that sense of urgency of always doing replaces what's sort of really important. So like being productive is like checking stuff off your list, and efficiency is like checking them off even faster. But that doesn't incorporate what is actually important. What are those activities that are most worthwhile? So what I would suggest is sort of like a paradigm shift away from efficiency towards what's worthwhile. So that if you're being productive and checking things off the list, that these are things that are really worthwhile spending your time on in the first place. So yes, I'm not saying be unproductive. I'm not, and as I said, I'm not suggesting quit your job and go, relax on the beach. But just being busy, just getting things done isn't the source of satisfaction. It is getting things done that are activities that are in line with your goals and what matters to you. And one of the most impactful exercises, well, I actually love all the exercises, but a very impactful one is actually one that helps identify what is important rather than just what's urgent. And that is writing your own eulogy, which I know sounds intense, and it is. And what it is leading one to do is sort of projecting forward to the end of their life and looking back, and how do you want to be remembered? What legacy do you want to leave? And what do you want people to say about you? What are those 3 words that you want people to say upon your passing? And this is actually not an exercise about death. It is absolutely an exercise about life. It is, what is the life that you want to live? And from writing that, what that highlights is what's important to you. What are your values? What is your purpose? And so that, and understanding those higher level things that are important, thinking about your life overall, informs how you spend your subsequent hours, so that you aren't just thinking about what's urgent in these incoming requests, irrespective of their importance. And instead, you're thinking about, is this important? Is this worthwhile for me and what matters to me, including the relationships, including your purpose-driven, passions. So yeah.
What about work? How important is aligning your 5 whys or your purpose with your employers?
I think there's a slight nuance in that it doesn't have to be aligned with your employers, but it should be aligned with the work that you do. So finding out what drives you then, and how does the work, what even activities within your work contribute to that. It doesn't necessarily have to be aligned with what the mission of the company is, or even your boss. But it is, to the extent, we spend, if you're working a full-time job, you're spending about 1/3 of your waking life working. So what you don't want to do is just sort of try to get through those hours. It's like, oh, I'm not, what is it, working to live? Whatever, living to work, whatever. You don't want to be just trying to get through the work hours in order to live your life, because this is your life. These are hours in your
Yeah.
life. So you do want to make sure that also within your workday, within your day, like the hours outside of your workday, across those, you want to be thinking about what's worthwhile and what's waste. But it doesn't necessarily have to align with your your boss or your organization.
We've done a considerable amount of research on working from home and working asynchronously, for example. You talked about the importance of relationships, flow, distractions, commuting, and how that can affect happiness. So how has the shift towards working from home affected happiness?
Yeah, and you see in some dimensions it's good, and then overall you see the accumulating hits on emotional well-being. So it's good that, since I mentioned previously that hours spent commuting are among people's least happy, so we have, if you're working from home, remove that waste. But what's really been missed, and again, you're starting to see the big effects of this, is that connection, that social connection. Sure, when you see your colleagues on a Zoom and all of them, you're like, oh, I see you guys. But you're not having those conversations that forge friendship. And there's this interesting question in a previous Gallup poll, which sounds silly, but in actuality, it's really critical, is, do you have a best friend at work? And though most people say no, those that say yes are significantly more engaged. They're better performers. They're more satisfied in their jobs. And a big predictor of life satisfaction is actually job satisfaction. So going again, it's not okay to get through your day. You're like, it's okay if I'm unhappy at work. That's not actually true, because your job satisfaction, how happy you are during those hours and about your work, sort of carries over to influence how satisfied and happy you are in your life overall. So in this work from home environment, those having a best friend, even making a friendship, a lot of people have changed jobs and joined organizations during this time. There's no way they're gonna make a new friend in this setting through work. Even for those who had friendships already, those friendships don't get cultivated or fostered. You sort of lose that sense of friendship. And so that is, I mean, if you're talking about retention, the thing that retains people is that they feel like they're spending their work days, their hours during the day with friends. And if you don't have that, then there's not a lot that's going to keep you other than the paycheck, which is extrinsically motivating, not intrinsically. And then, yeah, so it's this plus and minus. Also, we talked about the role of distraction and agency in one's time. It's become clear how important it is that people carve out time that is not on these Zoom calls, so that they can actually get the work done. And they carve out time, even though their work computer is in the space of their home. That doesn't mean that folks should always be working, right? There should be delineating and specifying that I am not at work right now. I am going to disconnect from that to fully connect and get that reprieve and rest and the break that one needs, so that they can re-engage wholly when they get back to work.
You talked about a couple of them briefly. What do you think the most impactful assignment that you give to your students is?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about several of them, so I will just sort of point out again, for reflection and insight into time spending, I would say the time tracking exercise, to help identify what's important to you, the 5 whys exercise, the eulogy exercise, And one that I haven't talked about, but which picks up on some of our earlier conversation, is the counting times left exercise. And this is something that is really important to recognize just how precious our time is, so that we don't miss out, so that we aren't subject to hedonic adaptation on these potential opportunities of joy. And so in this exercise, what I urge you to do is think back over the last couple of weeks. What were those, what is an activity that brought you joy, that you loved doing? Oftentimes, this is like a very everyday, mundane experience. And so like using, again, myself as an example, this is helpful because it's like, even in those busiest of weeks, I can absolutely identify experiences that brought me joy. So like my coffee date with my daughter, Lita, and this is something that we do once a week. So it's very sort of typical, regular. But the next step is to calculate how many times have we done this activity in the past. And so I calculated with Lita. So during my maternity leave, I would like bundle her up and take her to the coffee shop, which I counted as a coffee date, because I need to get out of the house. And that was like my source of joy. But then our weekly one since has been like the two of us, time together, just the two of us. We go to the coffee shop. She gets her hot chocolate. We get my flat white. We get croissants. And I calculated in our life so far, we've done about 400 coffee dates. Then the next step is calculate how many times in the future will you do this activity. I calculated, okay, accommodate, and you have to accommodate for like changes in your circumstances. If your moment of joy involves another, which it often does, but it doesn't have to. It could be like walking your dog or reading a book on, in that like comfy part of your room. But accounting for changes in, if there is another person or involved, changes in their circumstances. So I calculated for Lita, so she's 7, in like 5 years, she's probably gonna want to go to the coffee shop with her friends instead of me.
Yep.
God. And then she's going to go off to college. And then she's probably going to live somewhere that is not where we live. So I calculated that we have about 230 coffee dates left together. And then the last step is to calculate, of your total times doing this activity that you love, what percentage do you have left? And I calculated that we have about 35% of our coffee dates left. That's less than half. And she's 7. So what does that observation do? Well, it motivates me to make the time, to protect the time, to carve out time for this 30 minutes with my daughter. It also makes me pay attention during that time. These are precious minutes. So phone goes away, that constant to-do list that's running through my mind, quieted, because these are precious minutes. It highlights, yes, it's important, but this highlights that it is also urgent, which typically we don't feel like these things are urgent. We assume they will always be there. And so it's so important. And that's why I think this exercise is so impactful, is again, because it's not just the activities that we spend our time on, it's how we spend that time during those activities, so that the minutes that we spend, in this case, 30 minutes, colors how I spend the rest of the week. We look forward to this time. We reflect back on this time. When you ask me how happy I am, how satisfied I am in my life, I can say very, because I have this sense of connection. We talked about that important role of connection. I have this amazing relationship with my daughter. Yes, I spend more time with her outside of it, but it's really this crucial time that is sort of the grounding that relationship. So again, it's not about how much time you have, or even how much time you spend on your various activities. It's absolutely how you engage in it, so that you make those hours have as big of an impact as possible on how you reflect back on your weeks. how you think about your life overall.
Cassie, this has been great, and we have one final question for you. How do you define success in your life?
That if I create and disseminate knowledge about what makes people happy and make those around me happy, then success.
Awesome. This has been a great conversation. Thanks so much, Cassie, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.